Hi everyone, welcome to Bullet Points, a GoldFIsh Report series on focusing on an area of policy that we are currently dealing with right now as a country, something that is relevant to what the president is doing. And as you know, we focus on presidential powers usually. Just to remind everyone how this works, we present the first 15 to 20 minutes of our presentation on BitChute and YouTube for free. And because these are very in-depth topics that require so much preparation, and trust me, I tried getting this out several times and there was still more editing that had to be done. But I wanted to give a real comprehensive coverage of these topics and how they're related. So it's Saturday, February 9th, 2019, and so we're getting this done today. We're getting this out today. So as I said, this bullet points focuses on the presidential powers, emergency powers specifically of the president. And what you can do after the first 15 minutes is one way you can support the channel is to view the remainder of the report. You can go to our Vimeo on demand page, and there you can support our channel. You can either rent the remainder of the report or you can purchase it and create a library, as this will be an educational series. And of course, this is based on our current law. So you can go to Vimeo. There will be a link in the description section. You can go right there as soon as our first part is concluded, and you can watch the remainder, or you can watch it at a later time. So we do appreciate all of our viewers who do go to Vimeo and help to support the channel by continuing to view the remainder of the reports on Vimeo. That's how we can stay continuing to do what we do and bring this information to you and analysis. So without further ado, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to screen share our PowerPoints, and we're going to begin with this now. So this is, of course, our bullet points presentation. As I said, this is a GoldFIsh Report series, and we will be doing these hopefully more often, in addition to our interviews and, of course, our regular POTUS reports, as you've all become familiar with. Okay, bullet points, as you know, refers to the fact that this is a PowerPoint presentation and everything is bullet point on a PowerPoint, mostly. And also, it is kind of a play on words insofar as this does represent, a strong support for the U.S. Constitution and, of course, our Second Amendment and all of our privileges that the Constitution gives us. And so this is a play on words, of course. And of course, inspired by some very strong Second Amendment proponents and friends, and inspiration by individuals who are also very strong Second Amendment supporters. So without further ado, let's get right into this. This is about emergency powers. This is regarding the declaration of national emergency, and this is specifically within the context of a lot of the information is going to be general, but we are going to be talking about this in context of the border wall with Mexico. Okay, so here we go. This is the topic, and so part one will have most of what you see on the left side. We're going to talk about this U.S. Code subsection 284, which we'll discuss as we get there. Also, National Emergencies Act, International Emergency and Economic Powers Act, National Emergencies, War and National Defense. So that's a little bit more, it's another section of the U.S. Code there of the national emergencies. The Presidential Emergency Action Documents, or PEADS as they are known. I don't know if we're going to get to all of that in the first half, but I can tell you we're going to try. And then the second half, which we will discuss on Vimeo, will be including martial law and habeas corpus. And for our viewers who have followed our Country Road series, you know what habeas corpus is, because we did discuss this with my co-host at the time, Winston Shrout, who did discuss habeas corpus. So, and of course, we do have those available on Vimeo as well under the GoldFIsh Report. So there are, there's many of these types of presentations, but in a very different context, available under the GoldFIsh Report on Vimeo regarding habeas corpus. So let me just get my clock started here so I can keep track of the time that we're spending. Okay, so here we go. Posse Comitatus Act, now that's the second topic for the Vimeo, or part 2, we should say. Misuse of the Emergency Order, this is interesting. Supreme Court Precedents, current list of active emergency orders by the president. And I can tell you that there's almost 30. It's quite interesting, folks. So let's move on. Let's get going. So right now we're going to talk about the scope of the POTUS's reach on the border issue without declaring a national emergency. What can the president do now? And as you know from listening to his State of the Union, he deployed, and even before then, you know, and everyone knows, it's been reported that the president has deployed troops to our border. So the troops are not there in a combat, I would say, role, but they're there for support to the local border patrol. And this is basically what this law is saying here. This is the U.S. Code Title 10, Armed Forces, General Military Law, Organization, and General Military Powers. This is military support for civilian law enforcement agencies, which is what this is the law that's allowing the president right now to send those troops to the border. This is support for this is Section 284, and this is really important. This is support for counter-drug activities and activities to counter transnational organized crime, which the president talked about. So he talked about the drugs coming into the country through the southern border. He talked about the illegal trafficking, not only of drugs, but of people, of children. So this is the law where he's deriving his power from to send those troops to the border. And I have to say that we have in our POTUS report earlier this week, my co-host Jim Fetzer had this slide in his presentation, and he was accurately reporting that this top defense official testifies that Trump does not need a Congress or national emergency to build the border wall. During a House Armed Services Committee hearing on Tuesday, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy John Rood confirmed that President Trump holds the power to build a border wall with Mexico without congressional approval or by declaring a national emergency. Just take a look at how this is written, and I'm going to tell you I'm going to show you that he's wrong. This is wrong. This is not. This is very this is deceptive, because we're going to go into this law and I'm going to explain to you why he's wrong. And trust me, I don't get much pleasure out of saying that this man's wrong, but just a little, because he has an agenda, and his agenda is that you know, he doesn't want, you know, you could see that they're calling out to stop funding for the NSA, to cut the funding for NSA, because we're going to go into this and I'm going to explain why. This law, support for counter-drug activities and activities to counter transnational organized crime. I only highlighted the sections that were relevant because some of this related to international, and so we're only dealing with what we're dealing with on our border right now. However, it does say under this law that the Secretary of Defense may provide support for the counter-drug activities or activities to counter transnational organized crime of any other department or agency of the federal government or of any state, local, tribe, or foreign law enforcement agency for any of the purposes set forth in subsection B, which we will read, or C. And now C is international, so we're not going to cover that here. In the case of support described in subsection B, support is requested, and this is what's relevant to us. Okay, so the support for this has to be requested to send troops to the border with all their concertina wire and whatever other mechanisms that they may have to build a barrier at the wall there. This is where they're driving that power from. It may not be the only resource, but this is the law, basically, where that supports that action, okay? So accurately, so on one hand, the representative was correct that we can take some, according to this law, it says we can request support from the military to, as we're going to read, by the appropriate, also it has to be by an official who has responsibility, who is involved in the counter drug activities for the government with regard to these types of crimes. Okay. B, by the appropriate office of a state or local or tribal government in the case of support for local law enforcement, local or tribal law enforcement agencies. Okay, so a particular state can request this, but the appropriate official has to make the request. That's the point. Here we're talking about, in the case of support described in subsection C, if it is international, the support is requested by an appropriate official of a department or agency of the federal government in coordination with the Secretary of State. So that has to be regarding an international issue. B, as I pointed out before, it talks about B4 specifically. They're saying that you can request support for troops at the border, the establishment, including an unspecified minor military construction project and operation of bases of operation or training facilities for the purpose of facilitating counter-drug activities or activities to counter this transnational organized crime. Of the Department of Defense or any federal, state, or local or tribal law enforcement agency within or outside the United States. So here it's saying, yes, you can request assistance through for a minor military construction project and for operation of bases. Okay, we just read that. Here we have, let's continue. In providing support pursuant to subsection A, the Secretary may plan and execute otherwise valid military training or operations, including training exercises undertaken pursuant to this law, or this section of the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's where it's going. That's where it's coming from. And for the purposes of aiding civilian law enforcement agencies. This is it, folks. This is where the president gets his power from to say, and even a governor of a state, I believe, could do this too. And it's interesting because we'll see in the later parts of this presentation that certain states can act individually, but with request federal support based on their state's own crisis or situation that they're dealing with. So, however, congressional notification, section H of this, says not less than 15 days before providing support for any activity under subsection, the Secretary of Defense shall submit to the appropriate committees of Congress a written and electronic notice. And of course, there's certain things that have to be included in that. I'm not going to go into all the minutiae of it. Here it also says, in coordination with the Secretary of State, in providing notice under this subsection for the purpose described in subsection C, well, that would be international, the Secretary of Defense shall coordinate with the Secretary of State. So it's very specific, folks. Whether it's international or domestic, it's very clear what the president is doing. He's completely within the law to do. So you would think that the individual would have been correct in what he was stating. The problem is he didn't continue reading this, okay? Because here, the definition, section I, as you can see here, says the term small-scale construction means construction at a cost not to exceed $750,000 for any project. The president is requesting how much? A few $1 billion for the wall? I'm sorry, I have to go back. I touched that and it went forward. So we can see that $750,000 is not enough money for the president to build a wall, or even probably not even in one state, I would presume. And we all know much of the wall. There's already many sections of the wall already built, and I think that they're continuing to build the wall. But this $750,000 is going to run out pretty quickly. So you can see why the president has to go to Congress at this point to request an appropriation in the budget, okay? So here it says, however, when the government's ordinary powers might be insufficient in a crisis, the president may utilize presidential emergency powers to declare a national emergency to obtain the necessary resources to manage the crisis. In this case, the president has done his due diligence. He has gone to Congress. He says, put this in the appropriations, because that's what has to happen. That's the next, that would be the next step, is work with Congress. Okay, going into the national, so what I'm saying is that the individual was wrong. That no, he can't build a wall with $750,000. So, you know, in my opinion, from what I see here from this law, which he was referring to, he referenced this law. This is not, it's not possible for the president to build the wall on $750,000. Okay, now let's talk about national emergencies. Since we can't get Congress at this point, or as of today, we don't have an agreement, appropriations agreement on this budget to include the funding for the wall or any border, whatever border has to happen, whatever boundary has to happen to keep these traffickers out, child traffickers, to keep the drug trafficking, all the drugs out. We certainly want that. We want that. We want to keep it off of our streets. We want to keep it away from our kids and our family members. So, okay, we need to deal with this issue. And it has gone on too long, I would say, in the past, where so much has come into our border. So many drugs have come in. It's really an epidemic. And I'm really, really, really glad, and I give the president and the first lady a lot of credit for tackling this opioid epidemic. It is a problem. So many people are dying from overdoses, and even getting really bad, you know, mixtures, because who knows what you're really getting on the street. It's really not a good situation. So here we're talking about, this is where the president drives his power to declare a national emergency. Okay, right here, National Emergencies Act, 50 United States Code 1601, 1621, 1622. We're going to take a quick look at them. Any national emergency declared by the president in accordance with this title shall terminate if there is enacted into law a joint resolution terminating the emergency, or two, the president issues a proclamation terminating the emergency. So once a national emergency is declared, this is only two ways that you can terminate it. However, it will, unless it's only for a 1 year period of time or a 2 year period of time, and it does have to be renewed, and we're going to get into all of that, trust me. So here we go. Any national emergency declared by the president shall be terminated on the date specified in any joint resolution referred to in Clause 1, or on the date specified in the proclamation by the president terminating the emergency as provided in Clause 2 of this subsection. Whichever date is earlier, and any powers or authorities exercised by reason of said emergency shall cease to be exercised after such specified date, except that such termination shall not affect. Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to take a look at I highlighted the areas that were going to be relevant to this topic. This is the national emergencies this is under Title 50, War and National Defense. Clearly, Commander-in-Chief has the ability to declare a national emergency. So subchapter 1, terminating existing declarations. They started out, it's really interesting about this law, is that they started out talking about how to terminate them, which for whatever reason, that's just what they do. So, which we just talked about, but of course they do have an expiration date, which we all know that the president has to renew in order to, because it does have an automatic expiration date, so it has to be renewed in order to continue that. And later in our presentation, we're going to show a very long list of current active national emergencies that are still in effect, that every year have to be, and I show the list of orders that renew this particular Patriot Act. That's the example that we use, is the Patriot Act, the emergency order declared in the wake of September 11th, and that's one of the examples that we use. So here, subchapter 2, declarations of future national emergencies. So this is talking about, it's all done. There's a protocol for everything, folks. Declaration of national emergency by the president. It has to be published in the Federal Register, and we're going to also talk about effects on other laws and superseding legislation. Subchapter 3 is the exercise of emergency powers and authorities. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the president can and can't do, and we're going to show some precedents about this. So here we have war and national defense. So subchapter 4 talks about accountability and reporting requirements of the president. We'll talk about that, and application to powers and authorities of other provisions of law and actions taken thereunder. Okay, and congressional studies. So let's get into what we're going to talk about here. So subchapter 1, again, terminating existing declared emergencies. After a national emergency is declared, it can only be ended by a presidential proclamation or Congress, which we said. These emergency powers are intended to be temporary. So they're intended to be temporary. They're not intended to be a very long-term fix. It's supposed to be a stopgap until Congress can act, or that might be one option, until the emergency or the crisis has subsided. Okay, but this check has been entirely ignored. Congress has never voted on whether to end a state of emergency. So these are checks and balances, but for whatever reason, we don't have a record that Congress has ever voted to end a state of emergency for whatever reason. Okay, for the purpose of this section, the words "any national emergency" in effect means a general declaration of emergency made by the president. Okay, declaration of national emergency by reason of certain terrorist attacks. So here is an example, okay? Here is the proclamation number. This is September 14th, 2001. A national emergency exists by reason of the terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center, New York, and the Pentagon, and the continuing and immediate threat of further attacks on the United States. So this is our example here. This is the actual proclamation number. And we're going to look into that a little bit more. Okay, so a national emergency declared by the president in accordance with this subchapter. As I said, I'm sorry I repeated that. Right, president has to issue a proclamation to terminate this. Well, did President Bush ever issue a proclamation to terminate this? No, he didn't. And this is it here. This is now, therefore, I, George Bush, President of the United States, by virtue of the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, I hereby declare that the national emergency has existed since September 11th, 2001, and pursuant to the National Emergencies Act, which we talked about earlier, I intend to utilize the following statutes of the Title 10 United States Code, these sections of United States Code. Okay, this proclamation immediately shall be published in the Federal Register or disseminated through Emergency Federal Register, which is another one that I think that the Congress use among themselves, transmitted to the Congress. This proclamation is not intended to create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law by a party against the United States, its agencies, or its officers, or any person. In witness thereof, I have hereunto set my hand this 14th day of September in the year of our Lord 2001, and of the independence of the United States of America. Whoops, well, here we go. Okay, so, sorry, did I go the wrong direction? I did. 126th day. Okay, this is the actual proclamation. So you can see here, this is the Federal Register, and this is the actual proclamation. This is on September 2017. However, this one is by President Trump. So this is the continuation of this national emergency declared on September 11th, or right after September 11th, by originally by President Bush, and it has been continued by President Trump. You can see his signature here. This is in the Federal Register. This is the, basically, it's under presidential documents. So you can see here that consistent with this section, National Emergencies Act, Title 50, U.S. Code 1622, I'm continuing for 1 year the national emergency previously declared on September 14th, 2001. Proclamation 7463, with respect to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Because the terrorist threat continues, the national emergency declared on September 14th, 2001, and the powers and authorities adopted to deal with that emergency must continue in effect beyond September 14th, 2017. Therefore, I am continuing in effect for an additional year the national emergency declared on September 14th in response to certain terrorist attacks. This notice shall be published in the Federal Register and transmitted to Congress. So there you have it. That's the protocol. That's how you find out. And I'm going to show you, here's what the top of the Federal Register page website looks like. I couldn't fit the whole thing on here, believe it or not, but that I wanted you to be able to view it so you could get an idea what it looks like. But it's federalregister.gov, which is the website. And then down to the right-hand side, there's just a special list of presidential documents. So here you could see executive orders. This is what's current as of yesterday, February 8th, 2019. So executive order, and we also have continuation of national emergency, which is what we're talking about with respect to the terrorists who threaten to disrupt peace in the Middle East. Okay, so here we have, and also any proclamations that the president issues are listed here as well. You can see the total. So for January, you can see 4 determinations, 3 executive orders, 1 memorandum, 1 notice, 6 proclamations. February, we have the list as well. So, you know, a lot of people know about this, but there's a lot of people that don't. So for the people who don't know, this is, you know, where this is how it all connects together, okay? And where you can go to really find out what the presidential orders are, and that should be a big help. Okay, so this is the this is about the September 11th. This is the continuation of the national emergency. You know, it just seems like it's perpetual, isn't it? It's like a perpetual state of emergency, and sadly, under that category, certain laws change. We're going to talk about that probably in the second part of this, so that we have a better understanding that certain things are suspended under a national emergency, certain laws, essentially the Constitution. So, and certain freedoms that the Constitution grants us. So it's important to understand this, I think. So here we go. The notice of the President of the United States, dated September 11th, 2017. So this was by President Trump, provided consistent with Section 202 of the National Emergencies Act. I'm continuing for 1 year the national emergency. So they have to renew it every year. Most people already know this, okay? And it said that this is basically, again, just a repeat of what I just said, talking about what the protocol is and where you can find this information. So, as I promised, here is a list of all the renewals of this one particular continuation of the national emergency, but this is the 9/11. You know, so this is what helps to support the Patriot Act and keep the Patriot Act in, you know, current and still in use. So you can see here that, you know, it just goes back every year. You have to renew it every year. September 2016, 15, 2014, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. There we have it, folks. So the original one was good for a year, and you can see that every year this particular proclamation had to be, this declaration of national emergency had to be renewed every year. And there you have all the records of that. Okay, so this is how it works, and it's, you know, termination review of national emergencies by Congress, not later than 6 months after a national emergency is declared, and not later than the end of each 6-month period. Therefore, that such emergency continues, each House of Congress shall meet to consider a vote on a joint resolution to determine whether that emergency shall be terminated. And as I said before, that has never happened. From my research and records that I have come across, that has never happened. So, but that is, you know, that is the protocol. Okay, so when the president declares a national emergency, no powers or authorities may made available by statute for use in the event of an emergency shall be exercised unless and until the President specifies the provisions of law under which he proposes that he or other offices will act. So the President has to be very specific. If he's calling a national emergency, he can declare a state of emergency for, let's say, well, we do have some examples of this later on, but for instance, when there's a hurricane, Superstorm Sandy, Katrina, tornadoes, there are states of emergency where the state can request federal funding, which a lot of people know about already. But this just gives you a little bit more detail and tells you really more specifically. The President has to specify the provisions under law which he proposes that he or she or other officers will act. So, it's this, and of course everything will be published. That will be published in the declaration will be published in the Federal Register. Accountability and reporting requirements of the President. He has to maintain a file and an index of presidential orders, rules, and regulations during a national emergency. So the President can set this. I mean, the President has sweeping, broad range of, I would say, requirements for to meet and to face a particular type of emergency or crisis. He doesn't need all of them in every situation, so he will have to be very specific about what kind of rules and regulations and limits. Like for instance, if we need extra troops, if we need extra funding, if we need to have, I would say, I'm not so sure if it would be military tribunals, but there's definitely a military component to this, because the President, as we'll see later in the presentation, the President can declare martial law. So that's going to be really important. So I'm going to, let's see where we're going here. So basically, I'm going to end it here for our part 1, because we already went to 26 minutes, and I wanted to give viewers an introduction into the topics we're going to cover. We're also, as I said, going to cover habeas corpus. We're going to cover martial law and give examples. We're going to cover Supreme Court precedents that, why don't I just take this off screen share. We're also going to cover some precedents and challenges of martial law by the Supreme Court, cases that have happened already, and show that there's a precedent, and talk about the things that I mentioned in the beginning in our table of contents. So I do hope, if this is where we part, thank you for viewing, as always, and don't forget to go to our website at thegoldfishreport.com. And if you want to help us in other ways, you can go to our Patreon page, or you can go to our website, and you can make a contribution there if you feel inclined to do that. But it's the only way to keep our channel going is through viewer support. This is a viewer-supported public channel. So this is the public service that we're providing to the viewers for your benefit. So this is informational and educational, and we do enjoy bringing this information to folks to give you clarity on the complex issues that we are dealing with today, because we know that mainstream media tries to control the narrative. They try to argue the President doesn't have the authority to do these things, when we can clearly see in the law that he does. And not only that, we can clearly see that the law doesn't, there's limits to what he can do, and then he's forced by lack of cooperation from Congress to be having to exercise other options. Maybe we'll see what he does with this wall. We'll see what happens over the next few days. Congress has until, Nancy Pelosi has until February 15th in order to come up with a compromise on the appropriations bill, so which would fund the wall. So we'll see what happens. Otherwise, the President, as he has been saying and tweeting about, he can declare a national emergency, and he says he would prefer not doing that, but we'll see what happens. So folks, I want to thank you very much for viewing. The link to Vimeo is going to be below, and if you want to continue with us and join us to continue this presentation, we will be happy to have you join us and come along for that. So it's been a lot of work preparing this, and we do hope that everybody does enjoy it, and we do hope that you join us. So thanks for viewing.